to another episode of Recharging the Human Battery. Dr. Cinecropy is out again today, so you have me, Mandi Dickey, his wonderful co-host, nurse practitioner. And today I'm going to do something a little bit different with this day that's just me. I'm going to do what I'm going to call a TBI takeover, because my most of my experience has been in neurology for most of my practice. And as we've talked about here on the show before, about a year and a half ago now, I was in a car accident and had my own concussion, which was actually a TBI, not just a simple concussion. But I have felt the need to do more education about concussions since that time, because according to the statistics, approximately a quarter of the population has had a concussion at some point in their life. And we say approximately because most people do not get it diagnosed appropriately, or they might not even report their symptoms. Many people don't realize that they have a concussion. They don't really know what it entails. It used to be that you had to get a hit to the head and lose consciousness, and that's what it took to get a diagnosis of concussion. We've changed the terminology, we've changed the diagnosing criteria, and we now know that you don't have to lose consciousness in order to have a concussion, and it doesn't even have to be a hit to the head. You can get a hit to your chest, to your torso, to your body, and multiple different sports can cause injuries, not just the big, we used to think of football as kind of the big one, but even cheerleaders. They're throwing each other up in the air and catching each other, and that sudden catch at the end can cause enough trauma that they can actually get a concussion from that activity. So it's not just the big rough and tumble activities that cause concussion anymore. There's so much more involved in it. And lots of people are walking around with symptoms that they don't know what it's from, and it may or may not be related to a concussion. I gave myself a concussion one time by hitting myself on the car door, hitting my head on the car door when I opened it too quickly. And it can happen in the strangest of places. So I'm going to do periodically on my podcast, and I'll throw it in here on this show as well. My podcast is Brain Wellness, if you ever want to listen to that one also, because I do different conversations. I focus all on brain wellness there, whereas we just talked about it a little bit as part of our conversations about recharging the human battery here. But what I'm starting to do is something called the ABCs of concussion, because there are so many different symptoms that can show up, and people may or may not know that they are related to concussion. So what if you have some of these symptoms, or what if you are experiencing some of these after a known concussion? What can you do about them? So what I'm going to do is kind of break them down. Today, I'm going to start with the letter A, obviously, because that's the first letter of the alphabet. So the topics that I'm going to talk about today all start with the letter A. And this, like I said, came up based on my podcast, and I thought it would be a great thing to introduce here on this show as well, because again, we don't have good rates of concussion diagnosis because it's either not diagnosed appropriately, or people don't know that they've had it, so they're not reporting those symptoms, or because there's still that stigma around it, people don't want to report the symptoms, especially if they're in a sport that they might have to sit out for a while until they're fully healed. So topics today will include things like activity intolerance, advocating for yourself, aggression, amnesia, anxiety, apathy, appetite changes, and attention. So all of those A words we'll talk through today. If you like the topic of this show and you would love to hear something in the future episodes, if I bring this on again, then send a message in or a comment on the show of what word that you want me to focus on in that next episode, and I'll be glad to add that to my alphabet. So when we come back after the break, I will start up with the first word in our letter A's for ABCs of concussion. Welcome back after the break here, everybody, here on AM 950 Radio with Recharging the Human Battery. Again, me, Mandi Dickey, the co-host extraordinaire, all by myself today, talking about concussion. As I mentioned before the break, I'm going to go through the ABCs of concussion, starting with the letter A today. Listen in for future episodes when I'm stuck by myself, and I will bring another letter to you at that point. So the letter A today of ABCs of concussion. The first one I want to talk about is activity intolerance. This is something that I've experienced, that my friends that I've been communicating with, we call ourselves kind of TBI warriors, and a little group of us that have been trying to recover from our TBIs. And activity intolerance is something that is very prevalent with people who have experienced a concussion or TBI. For many, many years in concussion recovery, it was always said to rest. Everybody wanted you to rest and rest your brain, stay in a dark room until your symptoms got better. And people took that literally and stayed in that dark room for much longer than they needed to be. So there wasn't really a time frame for it before. Now we're starting to learn that it's really important for people after a head injury to start to get back into some sort of activity sooner than later. So really that 24 to 48 hour mark is the only time that you should actually rest and stay in the dark and stay away from activity. Once you've had that injury, and maybe you'll do it just because you're not feeling great after an injury, even if you don't know you had a head injury with it. But after that head injury, if it's a known one, you should rest for about 24 to 48 hours before trying to get back into any kind of activity. And at that point, it's not that you're just going to jump right back into that same strenuous workout that you were doing before, but you need to get back into it gradually. That said, the longer that you remain away from those activities, the longer it's going to take to get back to them. So that's why they don't want you waiting too long before you start getting back into any activity. The big thing, as I mentioned, is going to be that slow increase. And I'm going to repeat that probably multiple times as I talk about this particular topic, but slowly increasing those activities back to the ultimate goal is to get back to your normal activities sooner than later. If you are one of those lucky people that get a referral to physical therapy, one of the things that a physical therapist might do is what's called the Buffalo treadmill test. You won't know it as the patient as that term, but they'll put you on a treadmill and they will start you off at a slow pace, and they'll slowly increase the pace and slowly increase the incline on the treadmill to get you to figure out where that new baseline is. Before they start with that test, they're going to ask you where you are with your symptoms for headache, dizziness, blurry vision, lightheadedness, any of that. And then every minute and a half or so, they're going to ask that again and rate your symptoms again before they increase the rate and incline up to the point where they figure out where your limit is. Where is that wall that you hit when those symptoms come on really strong and you have to stop the activity? Whenever that they find that goal, that's your new benchmark. And now they're going to give you a recommendation that when you're exercising, when you're doing some sort of physical activity, you want to go to about 80% of what that new heart rate is, because that's going to be your set goal for the time being. That's not going to mean that that's going to be where you are forever, but that's where you are right now. And then every time you go into physical therapy, they're going to recheck you and reevaluate and see where you're at. So that sets that new goal. And that helps you gradually return to that activity so that you're not jumping in too quickly and having too many symptoms increase and keep you from moving on to the next step in your activities. The thing to note with that is just because you get to that goal where your symptoms increase, or is what I used to call it hitting my wall, or I actually still call it hitting my wall. When you get to that point where those symptoms increase, it's not because you're having a worsening of your injury. So having those increased symptoms does not increase your injury itself. It just lets you know where your limits are, where your limits are currently. So that tells you that benchmark. I'm a why person. I want to know why this happens. So again, whether or not you know you've had a head injury, but you have this activity intolerance, why is it happening? The why is because there is actual damage to the neurons happening. So the neurons there's little cells in our brain that sends information from one part of the brain to another. That's what tells your hand to move to grab something. Those neurons are sending that message from one to another to get that message to the nerves, to your hand, to your muscles to actually move and grab something. That's also the information that's coming in. So when you touch something hot, that hot message is going through neurons to get to your brain to tell you, hey, move that hand. And then you get that ultimate response there. So those neurons are very important for sending information through our brain, for helping us learn things, helping us speak. So it goes from the part of our brain that we think of a word to the mouth to actually create the word. The neurons pass all that information on. When a concussion happens, Again, it can be a hit to the head, it can be a hit to the chest that makes your head move. But whenever that happens, that trauma, that force, that energy that happens causes what we call shearing of the neurons. Those neurons get stretched. They can tear and they can break, but that membrane around the neurons becomes what we call more permeable, meaning things can pass through that membrane when they're not supposed to. So normally that membrane helps keep our electrolytes in our body, the ions in our body, in balance on one side of the membrane versus the other. So in our cells versus the bloodstream versus the tissues, we've got that balance, we've got that membrane holding it in place. But when that becomes more permeable, those ions can move wherever they want to. So initially with that injury, we get a rush of potassium that's going out of the cells and calcium is rushing into the cells. So those are places where we have what we call homeostasis in our body. We try to keep everything balanced, and the electrolytes have certain places that they're supposed to be in higher ratios than others. But when this happens with a concussion and we have that potassium rushing out of the cells and the calcium rushing into the cells, we now have what we call a metabolic dysfunction because we have disbalance. Our energy, our ions are in places that they're not supposed to be in high amounts. So we've talked a lot on this show about mitochondria, right? At Hypercharge Clinic, we focus on the mitochondria and helping to heal the mitochondria. Well, the mitochondria, again, if you didn't catch it on previous episodes, the mitochondria are the powerhouses of our cells. They produce the energy that literally incharges our entire internal battery. So the show is called Recharging the Human Battery. This is what our mitochondria do is they recharge us. They give us that charge, they give us the energy to function, to move, to think, to breathe, to eat, to do all the things that we have to do. When those mitochondria are surrounded by calcium, so with that influx of calcium into the cells, the mitochondria are now surrounded by calcium, they cannot make energy. So they can't make the energy that we need to heal our brain, to think, to do activities. So we have what's called active transport processes. That's what typically allows those different channels to open and close to allow the potassium and calcium to move between the cells and keep our ratios normal. But during this time of our brain being traumatized after the concussion, all of those active transport processes open in everywhere in the brain and the body to try to rebalance those ions, which that takes a lot of energy. So we have this causing this balance in influx where we now have too much energy demands in the body, and the mitochondria are not able to keep up to create that new energy. So we have this disbalance again. So not enough energy to do all the functions that we need to do. So the brain can't function efficiently because it doesn't have the energy that it needs. That leads to an exacerbation of symptoms anytime there is cerebral exertion. I'll put this in quotes. I learned this in a webinar that I took recently. I put it in quotes because I learned this many years ago in school, but after my brain injury itself, I've lost a lot of that memory that I learned and I spent so many years learning to become a nurse practitioner. But I lost a lot of that knowledge, so I learned it again in this webinar, and it was like an aha moment. It totally explained why my symptoms get worse when I have to use my brain more. So with that increased cerebral exertion, I don't have enough energy to come up with the energy needs that I have in order to keep my brain functioning, keep my body functioning, and that's why I hit that wall, that activity intolerance. So that is a huge topic. Probably could go on and on for an entire episode, but I'm going to cut it off right there and go on to the next one because these are all really good topics and I get fired up about all of them. So the next A I wanted to talk about is advocating. And this one is for somebody who knows that they have a concussion, knows that they have a TBI, going in for all of those health appointments and trying to get your needs met. As we talked about on this show, and I talked about it last week too, not all foods are created equal, not all calories are created equal, not all providers are created equal either. So Dr. Sinacropi and I are on this show and we're very open-minded and we try to think big picture with patients, but not everybody does that. And really, unless you're seeing a concussion specialist, the person that you're seeing probably won't have the answers. And I'll even kind of give the caveat that even if you see a concussion specialist, they probably don't have all the answers either. I've recently been looking at different certification programs for concussion specialists. And again, because I feel so drawn to it now, but as I'm looking at those, so many of them focus on the inside the box, the traditional occupational therapy, physical therapy, speech therapy, the traditional things that we've done for concussion care. Most of those specialist programs, even the certification programs, they focus on those inside the box thinkings. But it wasn't the traditional inside the box thinking that helped me get to where I am now. It was the addition of the complementary therapies, the red light therapies, the photobiomodulation, the transcranial laser, the neurofeedback, all the things that I was doing outside that traditional box. So even if you go to a concussion specialist, if they haven't had the training on all of those alternative complementary therapies, the outside the box thinking, you still might not have somebody who has all the answers for you. So we've talked about this on the show multiple times. If you don't feel like you're getting what you need, speak up. You need to advocate for yourself, ask more questions. And for those of you that might have head injuries, concussions, and you're going to doctor's appointments, I would highly, highly recommend that you bring either a trusted friend or a family member with you to those appointments to help you advocate for you if needed. Because as I think I've talked about this on the show before, but when I first had my concussion, I didn't realize what all symptoms I had. I didn't realize what all the problems that I had that were causing in my life. And my husband and other people would identify those things for me and bring it to my attention. And I may or may not remember to tell the providers when I went to my appointments. So that's why it's really important to have somebody with you that can see all those things that you might not recognize, because you being the one having the head injury, you might not recognize all the problems that you're experiencing. Then again, you might, and you just might not know what it's from. So they'll help you kind of organize your thoughts and get those out to your provider so that you can get the care that you need. The next A I wanted to cover is aggression or anger, or however you want to look at it. This aggression can come out as either verbal or physical aggression, and this by itself can be related to either mood disorders or personality changes, typically caused by the brain injury itself. That said, these aggressive episodes can be worse if the person who had a concussion has any pre-injury psychosocial difficulties. So if you have anxiety, depression, any mental health issues prior to your head injury, that's going to make things worse. If you have any alcohol or drug use or abuse issues, that's going to make that aggression worse. Frontal lobe damage. So somebody that had an injury to the front of their head is more likely to have aggressive issues than somebody who had an injury to different parts of the brain. What triggers this aggression? It can be triggered by really simple things: overstimulation, just too much going on around you, too many people talking, too much activity, grocery stores, shopping, social activities. Any of those can be overstimulating to somebody with a brain injury. And it doesn't take a lot. It can be just a small gathering, even in your own home, just having too many people over at one time. I've got 3 teenagers in my house. There's a lot of overstimulation going on a regular basis. Pain can trigger aggression. Hunger. So we always joke that when people are hangry, they're hungry and they get angry with it, right? So think about the Snickers commercials when somebody says, "Hey, you're not yourself, have a Snickers." That might help somebody with a TBI. It might not, but anger is a real thing when it comes to aggression after a concussion. Lack of independence can trigger these aggressive episodes or anger episodes in somebody who has a concussion. And that's going to be a big thing, because depending on the level of damage to your brain, you might have lost a lot of independence. It can be from not being able to balance your checkbook on your own, or balance your bank statements. Not everybody uses a checkbook. Not being able to drive independently because of vision issues or because of concentration issues. Any of those things that take away the independence of the person experiencing that head injury can be enough to trigger some aggression. Disability itself, kind of going along with that lack of independence. And then perception difficulties. And when I say perception, it's more of perceiving what's going on around you or other people understanding you. So If you have suffered a head injury, there's a good chance that you might not get the jokes that are being told around you quite as well. You don't understand the undertones in conversation. So perceiving things in a incorrectly for what's happening in a conversation or a social situation can lead to some aggression and anger if you perceive that as something different and something that's upsetting to you. At the same token, other people might not understand you quite as well because, as I've found out, I'm a bit more blunt than I used to be and a little bit more black and white. So there's not so much of this kind of dabbling in the gray area anymore. That black and whiteness can make people very angry and upset. The one thing that I've kind of took a token of this too is my youngest child has autism, and I kind of joke that I'm very much like him now at this point because neither one of us can really identify sarcasm quite as well, and that black and whiteness is definitely an issue. So having those kind of issues going on can cause a lot of anger and aggression in somebody that's had a head injury, especially like I said, if they had any kind of mental health issues underneath that. Along with that, something else that can cause aggression is amnesia. So, amnesia is our forgetfulness of something after an injury, right? There are two main types of amnesia: retrograde and anterograde. Retrograde amnesia is when you forget things prior to the injury. So, things that happened prior to the injury is either forgetting part of it or forgetting all of it. You forgetting things that happen prior to that injury. That itself usually improves over time. Those memories aren't gone. The bridges to get there might have been damaged, so you have to rebuild those bridges. That's where uh, that cognitive training comes in, and our neuroplasticity, where we can create those new connections again. But the memories are there. We just need to re-access them at some point, and that's the part that I'm working on a lot: is re-accessing that information that I had prior to my head injury. Anterograde, that's something a little bit more difficult to deal with. As I mentioned, that's difficulty forming the new memories. So this has happened after the accident. You have difficulty forming the new memories, which makes it difficult to learn things because you can't necessarily form the new memories. They're not sticking in your brain. They're not becoming permanent. As I worked with my speech therapist, we were talking about how memories are made and how we create those memories. We get these short-term memories. They have to go through a processing part where they get put into our brain, and we store them in our long-term memory, and then they put in a file. It's so that you can access them later on. But they have all these different processing steps between learning it, putting it in short-term memory, putting it in long-term memory, and then having it be permanent in your brain. That if you forget it anywhere in that process, it doesn't get to the storage part. It doesn't get into your brain. So you no longer have access to that. So you're not creating those new memories because it's not sticking. So that anterograde memory loss is much more difficult and much less likely to improve over time, except for through different exercises and such to try to retrain your brain how to remember things. This is where it's important to talk about the different levels of concussion. So we used to call concussions either level 1, 2, 3, and then in TBI we've got mild, moderate, severe. Those terms you'll still hear a lot, but it's in practice they're not really all that important because most of it's based on your symptoms. How many symptoms you have, how detrimental those symptoms are in your life. That's going to tell you more about whether it was mild, moderate, severe based on how much it affects your life. That said, when we talk about amnesia, when we talk about somebody that had a mild concussion, somebody that had symptoms maybe last for a few days, they tend not to have lasting amnesia. That doesn't go on for a long period of time. They might have forgotten things first off right after the injury, but those memories start to come back pretty quickly. When someone's had more severe head injuries into like the severe TBI category, those people can end up with permanent amnesia. They have permanent loss of memories and really struggle with short-term memory for especially. That long-term memory, things that happened before the accident, like I said, those improve over time and those tend to come back much easier than somebody who has that short-term memory problems now after the accident trying to relearn those new things. Someone who's had repeated head injuries, so either playing in sports or someone who just has really bad luck in life and lots of falls, lots of hitting heads on things. Multiple head injuries can lead to memory impairment that's permanent and neurodegenerative diseases. So I kind of this makes me think of Muhammad Ali, the big boxer Muhammad Ali. Later on in life, he was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, and they were able to identify that that was related to all of his head injuries in boxing. So, multiple head injuries can lead to long term permanent issues that we need to deal with. So, that amnesia is going to be different depending on the severity of your head injury, how many head injuries you've had. And that's going to be something that therapy is going to help you work on, lots of retraining your brain. The next A can actually be caused by amnesia. So all of these kind of go along with each other. Anxiety. So anxiety can happen because of changes in your brain following a head injury. These can be chemical changes, they can be structural changes. Any of those can lead to anxiety. Again, this can be triggered if you have a genetic risk. So if you yourself have that personal history or you have family history of depression, anxiety, those can put you at risk, and this head injury can trigger that. So all of a sudden you have anxiety issues where you didn't have that before. How can it present? It can look like many different things. It can start to look like a social anxiety. So after you have some sort of accident, all of a sudden now you're feeling anxious in a group of people, or you're feeling anxious when you have to give a presentation and you never had that before, or just too many people around you is overstimulating. You can't go to that party or that social activity anymore because it's too stimulating, it's too overwhelming. So it's very similar to like a social anxiety. It can also look like separation anxiety, where you need to have those trusted people around you. Otherwise, you don't feel comfortable. So you might not want to go out by yourself anymore, whereas before you were fine going places by yourself. Or if you have a loved one that goes to work or go to school, like my husband goes to work, my kids go to school. If they don't get home exactly when I expect them to get home, I still have issues where I get very anxious and I start to worry what the heck happened to them. So that new separation anxiety is a real thing that can be triggered again by that concussion. It can just be a matter of difficulty handling change. So changes, the only thing constant in life is change, right? Changes happen all the time. But to someone with an injured brain from a concussion, change can be very anxiety provoking. So trying to deal with a sudden change in plans at the last minute. Something happened, you can't go to the place where you wanted to go, and now you have to figure out something else. Or you drive to a restaurant that you really were looking forward to going to dinner, you get there and they're closed. And what do you do now? That change, that sudden need to change your plans can be, again, very anxiety provoking for somebody who's had a head injury. These anxiety issues can be short lived. They can be very, very short, like the other symptoms that you see with a concussion, or they can be long lasting. They sometimes can be permanent, again, like some of these other symptoms, depending on the severity of the injury and how well you learn to cope with it. And with that, again, you're going to need to probably learn some new coping skills and new coping strategies. My coping strategy has always been running, and for the longest time, I haven't been able to do it. So it's been really difficult to cope with some of that. So learning those new coping techniques is going to be very important. So again, if you have some of these symptoms and you didn't realize that you had a concussion, kind of think back and see, did something happen that maybe you did have a concussion that's leading to these symptoms? What do we do with this anxiety if we get it? It's going to be like anxiety with anything else. Mental health therapy is going to be very important for this, to talk through the issues that you're having, talk through the problems, and figure out how to deal with them, figure out those new coping techniques. Again, I'm wearing my Hypercharge shirt because I got to go to work after this. But Hypercharge Clinic, we do all the things that can help treat anxiety. Really, any of the topics that I talk about can be treated because it's related to a brain injury. But the photobiomodulation, that red light energy therapy, EWAT, exercise with oxygen therapy, really important for getting increased oxygen to your brain so that your brain can heal, so that you can deal with these anxiety issues that come after a brain injury. These things can be helpful for any of the problems typically that I talk about with concussion, because I found it so beneficial in the recovery from my injury. Neurofeedback can also be really, really beneficial for anxiety, whether you've had a concussion or not. Honestly, it's really helpful. Prescription medications are always an option as well. Research does show that if you pair prescription medications with mental health therapy, that combination tends to help people deal with anxiety better than either one of them alone. And then if you add the neurofeedback, you add the photobiomodulation in there, any of that combination, you're going to get an even bigger bang for your buck. And then hopefully at some point you can then wean back off of the medications because the other therapies have helped you so much. Regular exercise is something that we don't talk about often enough. It's a really underutilized prescription that we can deal with anxiety and depression issues. Now, that said, we talked about the activity intolerance of the first topic of the show. Regular activity, exercise does not have to mean really strenuous. It doesn't mean you go into a high intensity workout. It doesn't mean you go to the big gyms and do a big hard workout. You can just go for a walk. Go for a walk on a regular basis. That can be your regular exercise until you can tolerate more. And then improved sleep. Sleep is a topic that I will probably cover on a different show because that's not an A letter, but improving your sleep will definitely improve your anxiety, your mood in general, and overall help you heal better from your concussion. Another A letter then is one that people probably don't talk about quite as much. It's apathy. Apathy is, in case you don't know what it is somebody that has the appearance of not having emotions, otherwise known as a flat affect. So apathy just means that you don't really get excited when something good happens. You don't really get super sad when something bad happens. It appears like you have no emotions. But just because people don't look like they have emotions doesn't mean they feel them. People with apathy still feel the emotions. They just might not be able to show those emotions as well as they did before the injury happened. Again, the thing with apathy is that people may or may not recognize it. This is something you might not recognize in yourself. So if you've ever had somebody comment that you don't seem like you have emotions anymore, or they question if you feel something when you see something happen, or you have something really exciting happen in your life, other people might question this more in you than you do yourself because you might not notice it. So this is, again, where it's really important to have that trusted friend or close family member who can help monitor your symptoms. So if any of these symptoms show up and you don't recall having a head injury, think back and see if something might have happened that could possibly have led to a concussion. How do we treat apathy? Again, mental health therapy is going to be the biggest one, trying to kind of talk through and figure out how to express those emotions again. There's a lot of research that shows mindfulness and relaxation can help. Again, the photobiomodulation, that red light therapy can be beneficial for so many different things. It's also helpful for mood changes after concussion and head injury. The next topic is a little bit bigger again. Appetite changes. So appetite starts with an A, another A letter. Appetite changes after a concussion or head injury can include either a loss of appetite or overeating. It could be either one or somewhere in between. With overeating, we can see changes in the brain connections. Again, because of where injuries happen in the brain, frontal injuries more often cause issues with lack of self-restraint. So the frontal lobe of our brain is where we have our judgment, our personality. So many of these topics that I've talked about can more likely be seen after somebody's had a frontal lobe injury because of the structure and function that is responsible in that part of the brain. So lack of self-restraint can lead to overeating because you just don't know when you're full. You don't want to be done eating because you're enjoying something so much. And we can see that in regular everyday life. But if this is a sudden change for you, that's probably a good chance that it's related to a head injury or concussion. There's a thing called dysautonomia. Dysautonomia can also be known as autonomic nervous system dysfunction. Just lots of different words for that. The autonomic nervous system is responsible for our rest and digest. It's also responsible for our fight or flight. Those are both included in that. But the autonomic system also has a connection that goes down to our gut. So when we have dysautonomia, we have that dysfunction with the autonomic nervous system, it can actually slow down your digestion and it makes people feel full when they're not actually full. So that's going to decrease your appetite. So the rest of these things that I'm going to talk about are all decreasing your appetite after the injury. Smell and taste can be affected because of damage to the frontal part of the brain again. That can decrease your appetite. And for a long time, we've always known that there's this connection between the gut and the brain. Sometimes we call the gut our second brain or the brain our second gut, something like that. But that gut brain connection can be disrupted, leading to difficulty even identifying the sensation of being hungry. So after that head injury, you might not know that you're hungry. You might not know when to eat because you don't have those hunger sensations. How do we deal with that? The treatment with this is typically recommended to be eating smaller, more frequent meals, which that's all well and good to say. However, this was something that I experienced. So I can tell you from personal experience, eating smaller, more frequent meals may or may not help. Part of this other issue with this is that you might forget to eat. So again, with the memory issues, that amnesia, trouble remembering things, trouble learning new things, you might forget when it's time to eat or forget that you need to eat. So sometimes with that, you might actually need to set alarms for yourself or write it on your calendar. Setting alarms is probably going to be more effective because you're getting that alarm. I actually was setting alarms on my phone to remind myself to try to eat, because the more often you give that prompt, you might be asking your brain every time, am I hungry? Do I want something to eat yet? And that might be your signal to go find something to have a snack or something. And I talked with a nutritionist after this as well, one of the dietitians that I'd had on my podcast, and we talked about just briefly what to do if you're having that issue of lack of appetite after a head injury. And one of the things she was saying is if you can't get yourself to eat solid foods, eat something. So do something liquid. So getting in a protein shake. Protein is going to be really important for your brain recovery. So getting in that protein however you can is going to be a very important thing, whether it's taking in a little bit at a time every couple of hours, just giving your body that time to recover and time to think about the fact that, yeah, I need to eat. So now I should probably get something in my body. So setting alarms, getting that good nutrition in. And another thing that came up as I was initially going to hypercharge, I was recommended to start taking amino acids because I wasn't eating. I had that lack of appetite. And because I wasn't getting the calories that I needed, my brain wasn't really getting that opportunity to heal. So taking in those amino acids was a way to get in some of those essential proteins, even when I didn't feel hungry. So very, very important to get that one in. These appetite changes can come and go. And any of these symptoms, they don't necessarily show up the day that you have the head injury. So it might be a week or two later that you start noticing these things. And as you start to peel back the layers of concussion, it might be that you have identified one problem, you deal with it, you get help for the anxiety, for example, and then all of a sudden you realize something else is wrong. Now you realize that, oh, I haven't been eating. Oh, I haven't really been eating well since the accident. So now then you identify that there are those appetite changes and you address each one as they come along. The last issue I'm just going to start talking before we get on to the break here. This last one I'm going to tease you with is attention and ADHD. We talk about attention and ADHD as kind of some things that are rising in the general population. Is it related to changes in the food? Is it related to changes in schools, behaviors, whatever, our social constructs? What's going on that can lead to changes with our attention span in general? After a head injury, that's affected even more. So when we come back from the break, I'm going to get into this topic a little bit further, and we'll talk about why we see problems with attention and ADHD in somebody who's had a concussion. So again, after the break here on AM 950 Radio. Welcome back from the break here on AM 950 radio with Recharging the Human Battery. Again, Mandi Dickey here, finishing up the show today. We've been talking about the ABCs of concussion, starting with the letter A. So the topics I've covered so far, again, I will reiterate them as just in case you're just joining in now: activity intolerance, advocating for yourself, aggression, amnesia, anxiety, apathy, appetite changes. And then I started a teaser on attention and ADHD before we came to the break. So any of these topics, again, can be related to concussion, head injuries. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, concussion does not only happen when you have a head injury. It can be from anything that causes your brain to slosh around inside of your skull, honestly. It can be a hit to the head. It can be a hit to the chest. It can be falling and catching yourself and not actually falling. That can be enough trauma. Whiplash on a car accident, when you have more trauma to your neck than your brain, just the whiplash itself, that pain, those pain signals can cause changes in your brain that look just like a head injury. So lots of things can cause it. Many people don't know that they have it because, again, terms that we used to use were just say that somebody got their bell rung or something like that. And people don't necessarily all receive health care for these symptoms that may or may not be related to this new head injury or the new concussion. So I hate using the term head injury again because it doesn't have to be an injury to your head that causes these symptoms. The symptoms may or may not show up right away. So if you have one of these incidents happen and you might feel okay right away, you might just feel kind of tired, run down, but you don't really realize anything about it. You try to go back to school or work and then you're having difficulty. And then you're trying to find a provider to get into later on because you have symptoms and you don't know what it's related to. Some of these symptoms are kind of vague. Some of these symptoms can happen based on anything else that happens in your life. And it doesn't have to be a concussion or a TBI that causes it. But if they are a sudden change in your life, you have not had these problems before, and now you do, take a step back and look at some of your recent activities and events and think, was there anything that may have led to a brain injury in this, that may have led to concussion? And that's going to be your big starting point. We here in the Twin Cities have a few different TBI programs that you can go and get assessed and get therapies outside of our traditional medical system. We've got Hypercharge Clinic, and we're doing a lot of really big things with brain. We are offering brain scans now where we can look and identify if somebody's had a concussion. Lots of things that we can do to try to help you, including the photobiomodulation, the transcranial laser, all the things that helped me that I did 3 times a week for 6 months before I was even able to get back to any kind of work. So it's beneficial. It's helpful. The traditional medical model did not get me alone to where I am. It was the outside the box thinking that we need to not think of as outside the box, because I think of it as inside my toolbox now. All of those things are there. So again, let's get back to this last topic of attention and ADHD. So with attention and ADHD, it is a rising concern in the general population, but there's a lot of research to show that up to 50% of anyone who experiences a TBI can develop ADHD symptoms. So things that look like you have ADHD now. That is half of everyone that has a TBI. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, it's estimated that about a quarter of the population has had a concussion at some point in their lifetime. So if we think that half of all of those will end up with ADHD, that's an eighth of our population that has potential for ADHD symptoms. This, as I was looking through the research, again, I was doing a bunch of PubMed searches trying to find just a little bit of information to share with you today. And in every article that I found on PubMed, this is a problem that affects every age group that has TBI. So again, up to 50% experiencing a TBI. What do we need to do with this? Limit distractions. Focus on one activity at a time. I always say now that I cannot multitask very well. Sometimes I have trouble tasking at all, but limiting those distractions, focusing on one activity, trying to deal with those symptoms as much as you possibly can. And that will help you so much with this. So that is my ABCs of concussion, starting with the letter A. That we'll probably hear more episodes coming up in the future on that. But thank you for being here today with me. And from here on out, make sure that you take care of yourselves, watch your family members, watch yourself, be healthy, and see you next time.